welcome to the podcast, The Year of Bach. My name is Evan Goldfine, and today I welcome Scott Tennant, one of the great classical guitar players and teachers of our era. Scott was a founding member of the Grammy Award-winning group Los Angeles Guitar Quartet, and he is currently the chair of the classical guitar program at USC's Thornton School of Music. Scott, welcome.
Thanks for inviting me, Evan.
Yeah.
Glad to be here.
So let's talk about young Scott at the guitar. Were you drawn to Bach initially? Was it more like homework?
Oh boy. It was Bach. It was mostly the guitar itself and the sound of it. I started taking lessons when I was 6 at a music store. And what drew me to classical music in general was, in these books that I was, my weekly lessons were in, there were little snippets of Bach, Anna Magdalena Bach, the famous little minuets and musettes. And then there was some Tchaikovsky. And I thought, this music sounds really unique as opposed to like the more poppy kind of songs I was working on. And I asked my teacher, I love this composer, I love that composer. And she said, oh, well, that's called classical music. Mm. And so I started doing a deep dive, and I, of course, then found Bach. And it turns out my parents were very involved in having my brother and I listen to a lot of music. My mom had been a musician in her youth. And so we were always listening to every kind of music. And we had, remember the records, the LPs?
Sure.
Had a lot of those. That's probably where I first heard Bach. And then I got this crazy record by the then Walter Carlos, who became Wendy Carlos.
Switched on Bach.
On a Moog synthesizer. And that blew me away. I heard the Bach Brandenburg, third Brandenburg. And that's the first time I heard any of the Brandenburgs on a Moog synthesizer.
Very strange.
And it just proves that Bach is very user-friendly. You can play his music on pretty much anything.
Yeah.
And his music is so versatile. And so anyway, I became a fan and slowly learned about Bach as I went on.
Any special recordings besides Switched on Bach from the 70s and those early years?
Let's see. We had orchestral recordings. They were mostly these LPs that had a combination of different composers. And I know the Chicago Symphony was one. Mm-hmm. I don't know, maybe it was Schulte or who was conducting at the time. But they were orchestral renditions. And my first Bach listening experience was with orchestra, and frankly, they were kind of orchestral arrangements. I think of the famous, the air and a G string, and
sure, those
kinds of things. But I didn't really start diving into Bach until I started taking classical guitar lessons when I was 11. And of course, it was just like Bach, and I just started going crazy, discovering all of this, the Bach that I could play. And that was, it was just a racetrack from there. Learn all the Bach I could.
Was it Segovia? Was it Bream? Were these things you were listening to as references, or were you just going by reading through it and hearing what it was underneath your fingers and what your teacher was helping you with?
Well, it was my first actual Bach album was John Williams playing all of the Lute Suites.
Yes.
And that, of course, John Williams, I was such a huge fan, am still a huge fan of his. And I wore the record out. I think my dad had to buy me a second LP of the same recording. It just blew me away. And I realized now, as a kid, I started things, it was kind of strong-willed. And my teacher would tell me, no, don't play us too hard. But I would start things anyway. And I remember starting the fourth Lute Suite, right? There are 4 Lute Suites, as you probably know. And I started the fourth one. And so I remember just struggling through it. And I thought, well, I can play it just like John Williams if I just copy it. So I listened to it all the time, trying to copy I kind of figured his fingerings out, which, for a 12-year-old wasn't too bad. And of course, I can never play it like him, but that was a start. And long story longer, that's the only Bach suite I've ever actually recorded myself. I played it for years and years in concert. And because of that I started when I was too young and my teacher was right. I wasn't ready. I had a hang up on that prelude of the suite, the first movement of the suite, all my life. And to this day, so I stopped because of that prelude. I actually stopped programming Bach because I had such hangups with it.
Wait, what? What's going on?
I had, because I learned it when it was too hard for me. And I eventually worked it out and was able to play it and learn the whole suite and started programming it. In fact, a lot of times I would begin my program with it because I thought the prelude made such a great opener. And it does.
Yeah.
But with all the nerves that go into performances anyway, and my, I should say maybe lack of confidence with that one movement, I carried on for a while, for many years, and I just stopped programming that suite. And eventually I just stopped programming Bach for a while just because I gave myself a hang up with Bach that it was so hard. And I didn't want to mess up, didn't want to make any mistakes with playing Bach because everybody loved Bach and everybody knew Bach, the music. And so I just thought I'll give it a rest.
Huh. I know that recording. It's from your guitar recital record from many years ago. And it's excellent. I love that record. There's a kind of brashness and youthful confidence and this real meaty sound. I think it's great, especially in that prelude. There's those moments where the downbeat seems to be playing around when it goes down to those two notes back and forth. Da, 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 da. I came upon this organ piece, there's like 50 hours of organ music. And I suddenly heard the Lute Suite again. And I was like, that is strange and familiar. And I like it more on the guitar. I didn't want all of the sustaining notes as much. I kind of liked how the sound of the guitar, once the note is plucked, it sort of goes away. And so you need to find the different ways to keep those strings and notes echoing or not, as your case of your interpretation might be. What about that moment that I'm talking about that goes back and forth?
Right. I know that this spot, it happens in the A section and then later in another key, very symmetrically. The version most guitarists play has some element of the solo violin version, which really opened my ears to what the piece was really about. The organ, of course, the Sinfonia, which is an F major. But it might be because of the bowing where the note you think is the downbeat, forgive my singing, isn't the downbeat, right? I think that's what you're talking about. So
yes.
Then I played a version where I kind of I inverted the two notes, the upper one and the lower one, so that the downbeat of that is actually a lower note. Here's the thing. When in guitar, when you use your thumb for, let's say, when you're using your thumb, let's say, in a pattern like that, whether you intend for the note with the thumb to be played out or not, it's going to be accented a little bit.
It's going to sound like a downbeat.
Yeah. And so I refingered it and I stopped playing that note with the thumb and it worked out perfectly. The thing about Bach is that it's, everything's so interchangeable in a way. Everything that I was learning from an early age was kind of Segovia centric. Segovia arranged a lot of different pieces. Instead of playing whole suites, he divided up suites and published them and played them separately because he was trying to promote the guitar at that time. And he was afraid, well, if my audience sits through a whole suite, they could get turned off by it. Let's just give them a little bit of everything. So I had that in my head as I was learning guitar from an early age. And so everything was Segovia centered, the chaconne, his arrangement of the chaconne very famous, and many of his other Bach pieces. So I had this thing, well, you have to add a lot of bass notes, right? Because he would reconfigure things, and he would take a single line like a violin and put a lot of bass notes in. And so then there was this trend, because of that, there was this trend later of, well, let's get away from that. And everybody was playing pieces more or less in the original form, like the single line, even going back to the original key that worked, let's say, on violin, or maybe not on cello, but maybe it didn't work as well on guitar. So then I went through that phase, and that as a student, I arranged all of the Bach cello suites, wrote them down by hand, and have a notebook full of them, of all the cello suites that I arranged, only adding a little bass notes sparingly because of that, the philosophy that I built up in my head. And so now I'm completely turned around, the opposite. I think Bach, his thing was adaptability. So if he had heard me playing a guitar with all these strings, playing a single line without adding anything, he would think I was crazy. He would say, what are you doing wasting all of these other notes you could be playing?
There's opportunity.
Yeah. And when I do arrange something, I don't add much, but I do fill things out.
Yeah. How is Segovia living with you today? It's such an important musician for so many of us, and you've recorded an album of Segovia's music, which is excellent. Probably your most recent release. How has that lived with you, and how has his performances changed in your mind as you've come into your own throughout your career?
Segovia will always have a particular throne in my pantheon of heroes because, when I was young, he was probably the biggest influence, and he influenced, I remember reading a quote that he mentioned about John Williams. So everybody parkening Williams, everybody had the quote by Segovia. And so he was the king. And the guitar has progressed a lot. And there are players that play it with different technique now, with different approaches to plucking and all that. And certainly different approaches to fingering. So there's been all that happening over the decades, but I still hold him in very high esteem, and I listen to him a lot. And now it's even more pleasurable to go back and listen to a Segovia recording and watch a concert.
When I first started playing classical guitar, I loved the Spanish music. In the very beginning, just playing the root E minor chord and just strumming down. It's like, what is this amazing big sound? All these different overtones coming through, and you felt it resonating against your body. So that sound, the early Spanish music that I learned of Albéniz and Rodrigo and Torrega, which you've recorded, and also Bach. I think that most good classical guitar students, whether they're in the beginning or they're advanced, tend to like both the traditional Spanish music and Bach on the guitar, which is weird because those tastes don't necessarily fit together on their own outside of the guitar. Do you agree with that take? What do you make of that we all love this music so much that's so different from each other?
I agree with that. I know what you're saying. There's something about people who are drawn to the guitar. It's a lot to do with the sound. A lot of them, first of all, do come from a electric guitar background. So most of the classical guitarists I know now have started in rock and playing with the rock band in the garage, or playing jazz, or I know a couple that even come from playing country, and they just and they aspire to this sort of classical. It's kind of this mountaintop that everybody wants to get to. So with the finger style and the sound you get from the nylon strings, it's a very special type of instrumental style. And so I think anything to fanatics like myself, I remember back when I was that person you're talking about, that young student, everything sounded good on guitar. I just loved to listen to anything. Yeah, but it was amazing that Bach specifically, I got just as much pleasure and thrill out of listening to Bach than I did listening to a really fiery Spanish like Rodrigo.
Yeah.
Wow, there was a discovery. And now that I'm a teacher, I've been for a long time, and I see young students coming, there's still that fascination with the sound of playing Bach on a guitar, just like Albanus or any other composer,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. I love the way that the instrument resonates against my body. It feels more connected. I've been learning how to play piano. Again, I took a 35, 40-year break in the middle. I'm getting back to it. And there's something very important and tactile, but the instrument isn't resonating against me. And I think you get that with the guitar, especially, and probably some of the bowed instruments, people to get that feeling. And it can be quite a warm sound, as well as you can get some real volume out of it too. You can play beautifully soft and beautifully when going fortissimo as well. So there's a huge range, and I think people resonate with that too.
That is true. Yeah,
Yeah.
very true.
So you've been a teacher for many years, and one of the themes that I keep returning to in these interviews that I've been doing is sussing out what makes a great performance. And you've been seeing these younger students kind of put their own personal individual spins on all of these pieces that you've heard many, many times. How do you articulate what a good performance is?
Ultimately, when I'm hearing a performance, I want to make sure I hear the performer as well as the composer. So I know what Bach sounds like stylistically and a lot of other composers. I know sometimes I know the actual piece of music I'm hearing. So I know the music, I know the style. But I feel if I don't hear the performer speaking to me, then something's lacking. And certainly, it'll be a lifelong struggle with myself too, just doing that. Always trying to put my, how can my stamp on it? How can I communicate this that really reflects myself? And I try to instill that in the students, and we work on that a lot. So obviously, we work on learning. We want the right notes,
Sure.
stylistically, ornamented in a certain way, but not over ornamented. This really intricate stuff. But down in the end, I want to hear the person that's playing it. So it's making it personal.
How does that personality come through in a performance? And I'm just bugging you on this because this is something that I've been ruminating on for months since I started these interviews. It's like, what actually makes, how does one convey one's self through their musical performance? I mean, I hear it. I know all the different kinds of pianists and guitarists and musicians that they just sound like them. I don't know how you do that. Like, it's a magic trick to know that that's a Segovia record or that's a Scott Tennant record, or the LAGQ is maybe cheating a little bit because of the sonic timbre that you get with the four guitars. But what does it take to create that unique sound?
You brought up a good point about knowing when you're hearing a particular performer. It comes down to, of course, their style, but their tone. And with guitar, those listeners who don't play classical guitar or know the details, we have some fingernail growing out on our right hand to pluck the string. Depending on the person and their style and their teacher, et cetera, the nail could be longer or shorter. And that could change daily, depending on the weather. You reach into your pocket for your keys and you come out with half a nail left, something broke. So we're always gluing repair things on our nails to just keep them so we can play. But ultimately, you have to have control of your tone. And because it's a direct contact, we don't have a key or a mouthpiece or a bow. It's really, and that's what I love about it. It's very tactile. It's a very personal thing. So ultimately, it's working on your tone to the point where you develop your own touch, where I can tell just by listening which one of my students or teachers or friends are playing.
That's
Right.
so cool. Yeah. To be able to do that. I think some very astute listeners can do that with their records, that they just know which particular performances they are just by picking up a particular beginning of the Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. I can probably do that with many records, but there's thousands of recordings now of these things. How many Albani's, Leyenda have you heard? I mean, there's hundreds.
A few.
I'd love to talk a little bit about one of your ex-bandmates, Andrew York, a great guitarist and composer. Given how much guitar people play, I've been sort of surprised by the relative lack of new classical repertoire for guitar that people love compared to the flourishing of that music that people play that's 80 years old. A lot of the
Mhm.
energy in contemporary guitar composition has moved towards steel string, and there's a lot of like popping and tapping and drumming on the guitar, some of which is fine, some of which is a very small amount is excellent, but a lot of it is just sort of flashy. My aunt would call it flash on trash. That's what I'm gonna probably edit that part out. But I think Andrew is probably the greatest compositional voice of contemporary classical guitar. People love to play that music, and I'm curious as to what your take is on his music. You've played his recordings and his arrangements for decades, and even featured some of his compositions on your solo records. So what can Andrew do? Why is his language so special? What makes it unique, and what resonates with you about it?
Well, of course, Andy's been one of my closest friends for so long. We met at the USC when he first came in as a grad student. We had a program called Studio Guitar. It was called commercial guitar then for a while. But really, he was a jazz guitarist that came to study jazz. But he already had sort of mastered the classical guitar style with the plucking with the nails. And I know one of his heroes he would talk about a lot was Ralph Towner,
Yeah.
because Ralph was doing the same kinds of things that Andy, I think, really aspired toward, writing his own music, playing, with the guitar in the left leg, classical style, etc. And he was already writing music for acoustic guitar back then when I met him. And I've always loved his style. It is people friendly.
Mm.
It's not challenging to listen to more than as it is satisfying and deeply personal in most cases. People can latch on to something that speaks to them when they listen to his music, including myself.
Yeah.
And I'll always be a fan of his music.
It is very user friendly, as you would say, or listener friendly. I wonder if there's some pressure from the establishment when people are writing these music. I mean, we're 100 years after 12 tone rows were invented, and 70 years after Shostakovich, and then going out to like Webern and all these kind of really out guys. Are is it sort of déclassé to write something as user friendly as that, or is it not seen as impressive among in the conservatories? Is that why we might be not seeing such accessible music?
I think music has to be genuine. I think, Schoenberg, for instance, started out as a neoclassical composer that developed this idea of 12 tone, now 12 tonality or 12 tone tonality, however you want to phrase it. And then a lot of people followed, and it was kind of a new thing. Everybody's looking for the new thing. But I always found that music not genuine. I have friends who it speaks to, but ultimately, speaking particularly of Andy's music, it's genuine. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really, it's him. And I don't want to suggest at all that by saying it's listener friendly, that it's easy music
Oh, no, no,
or that
no.
it's not deep. But I think people, I know him, so I can tell it's him speaking through the music. But I think those who don't know him also feel a real connection because it comes from a true place
Yeah.
and not something that somebody's trying to be. He is just who he is, and he expresses that exceedingly well.
Yeah. There was a track on an album he put out a few years ago called Yamour, the title track from that album, where out of nowhere he starts singing, and he's
Mhm.
singing along with it. And it's such a surprise. I don't think he ever sung on record before, but it was such an amazing organic piece of music that like it felt a spontaneous outpouring almost. And it was so key to that piece. And Andy doesn't have the best voice in the world, but it's perfect in that moment. And that piece really speaks to me a lot.
wrote a piece for me. You know, he he was always trying to get me to come out of my shell, and it's hard to believe, I guess, that I have a shell. But I am by nature a shy person, and so I could do the classical persona really well because it's somebody else's music, and I put my stamp on it. And he always, man, you gotta commit more and come out of your shell. And I didn't know what he meant. So finally, he appeared with this piece. I wrote you a piece, and it's called "Letting Go." And you have to sing. And I was, oh God, don't make me sing. Don't make people hear me sing, please. And it's kind of like Yamour, where the vocal part is very easy. It's very simple, and it's completely woven into the fabric of the music. You know, you have to do it. So I played that. I don't play it nearly enough now because I just, when it comes time for you to sing, I'm still a little bit shy about that. And he's been doing more and more of that,
As
with
someone,
kind of other elements.
as someone who is admitting to being shy, I mean, you're a professional performer in front of other people. Does that play into stage fright, or have you been able to manage that, or you just know the material so well, it's just a part of you that you can easily make that outpouring through your discipline and your artistry?
Of course, we all get, I try not to use the word nervous, and I don't want my students to use the word nervous. We say excited. So yeah, I get overly excited sometimes with a little too much adrenaline and the sweats. I think that's natural. I think it means that you care about what you're going to present. You care about the music. But I always enjoyed sharing music with people, especially as a kid. I'd play something half learned. In fact, I would just stop at a particular section if I didn't learn that part yet, just because I wanted to play it for people. I was so just enthusiastic about the music. I wanted people to hear it. I still have that. I've never been the type to, I don't know, over promote myself at all, or I just enjoyed playing music for people. Whenever I felt I was too much in the spotlight, I would shy away a little bit. And that ties in again to Andy writing "Letting Go" for me, because, he wanted me to open up and feel comfortable with going beyond just sharing notes and sharing more of myself. So that was a good lesson in itself. I think we all get nervous. It's a fight or flight thing, where whether you're speaking in front of people, frankly, I get a little fight or flight with things like this, where I have to talk. I'm not a great speaker.
You're doing great.
But I think it's a natural thing when you're suddenly in front of people and you feel that you're in the spotlight, maybe being judged.
Yeah.
So what I've done is I turn that around, and I consider, so people who are there staring at me, waiting for me to do something, I see them as my guests. So they're in my living room, right? And they're all my guests, right? I'm not in their space. They're in my space. And, I can look out. I like to talk to them and explain the music. And it becomes more of a communication love fest. And you make that connection. They make the connection. And it completely lowers that screen you put in front of yourself of being scared.
I'm taken by your observation that you didn't want too much of a spotlight on yourself, and you ended up having a breakthrough career in a quartet, which allows you to share that spotlight with three other people, which is strategic and great for you that you'd had that opportunity. It was
the best.
I always heard you as the anchor sound of that band. I don't know if that resonates with you, but that's the compliment that I'm trying to offer.
I got most of the fast stuff just because I was a speed demon when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And I could just, if they wanted something fast, I could just at least fake it. I got a little tired of being the pyrotechnician, but it was fun. It was just so much fun. And it was good for a kind of a shy, supportive type like me.
Yeah.
To be in a group.
Well, I'm glad we got to do a little psychotherapy also at the end of this.
I feel much better. Thank you.
Scott, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. I had one final question for you. You're working with ambitious students now at USC, as you have been for many years. How are the kids these days doing? I've been reading about how the attention spans are going down and discipline's going down. Do these students still have the same sort of drive as the ones you saw 20 years ago? And do they love Bach as much as the ones from that period as well?
With all the things that are going on that you mentioned, the attention spans, it's a real thing.
Yeah.
Of all the things I could mention, everybody still is crazy about Bach. They all want to play Bach. And if I were to tell them to go listen to some classical, not even Baroque, just go listen to some music, they would choose Bach. They would choose Bach.
Good choice.
Yeah, yeah, I'm happy to listen. When they do choose it.
One final question. Any particular recordings that are important to you right now that you've been listening to of late?
Oh gosh, I still love listening to John. Anything with John Williams. My teacher Pepe Romero and his brothers, they're always on the top of my listening shelf. And then David Russell, yeah, just the old greats. I was really saddened to hear that Kazarita Yamashita
Ah, yeah.
passed away recently because I knew him. I was his chauffeur whenever he would come to LA.
Yeah. What kind of guy
And
was he?
he was very serious. And there, you have to, in context, as a kid, he was playing concerts from a very early age. His father, so I actually asked him about it. He agreed. He said, yes, it's true. His father, he had to practice 12 hours a day.
Oh my goodness.
His father took care of everything. Here's when you eat, here's when you sleep. We travel here. But even during the concert days, it was so instilled in him that when he finally got on the road by himself, he would practice all day and then give the concert. A very disciplined person, but my task, my self-imposed task, I'm going to make him laugh. I need to see him smile, to have some fun. And so we would go out and have some dinner. He would loosen up a little bit,
Yeah.
but he was very serious in a good way. He really, really, really loved the guitar and loved music, and so he'll be missed.
The only other person I've heard about that with the discipline with the guitar from a father was the great jazz guitarist Joe Pass.
So
A very abusive father made him practice hours and hours a day, and he became one of the greatest, but I think it was at some personal cost. My favorite albums from John Williams and David Russell are Latin American Guitar Festival by John Williams and the music of Barrios by David Russell, which is just a wonderful album. Scott, thanks for sharing that with us and also your love of Bach and for all the great music. I will link to your website. And thank you again.
thanks, Evan. Keep doing what you're doing. It's a wonderful thing, and people are going to benefit from it. Just hearing how much you love Bach and how much you love music.
Thank you.